Wyoming Territory, 1873, the wind tore over the plains like it was trying to strip the land bare, but the cowboy in the saddle had seen worse. Orin Callahan rode with dust in his teeth, sun in his eyes, and a coil of something sharp and quiet in his chest. He had been driving cattle east toward Cheyenne when the storm rolled in and scattered the herd. Now, with only 3 head trailing behind and dusk lowering fast, he was looking for shelter. That was when he saw her. The house was more bones than home, half-rotted porch, no glass in the windows, roof patched with tin and cloth. The land around it was dry as a preacher's sermon, nothing but brittle weeds and cracked earth. But the woman standing in the doorway had a rifle in her hands and a child clinging to her skirts, and Orin reined in without thinking twice. "Evening," he said, hat tipped low, voice steady. "I do not mean trouble." The woman did not lower the rifle. "You lost?" she asked. Her voice was sharp but tired. She looked no more than 25, but her eyes held years beyond that. Orin shook his head. "Storm blew my herd apart, looking to bed down till morning." He glanced at the boy beside her. "Maybe 6, maybe 7. You got nowhere else by the look of things." She glanced back into the dark house like she was weighing something, then she stepped aside. "You can sleep in the barn. If you touch anything that ain't yours, I shoot you." "Fair enough," Orin said, and swung down from his horse. That night, the wind howled and the barn creaked, and the cattle moaned low in their throats. Orin sat up with his back against a post, watching the shadows stretch and bend. He could not stop thinking about her, the woman with dust in her hair and a rifle in her hands. She had nothing, no crops, no livestock, barely a roof, but there she was, standing bold like she had something to protect. In the morning, he found her outside, trying to split wood with a dull axe. "You'll break your back before you break that log," he said. She looked up, sweat already on her brow. "You got a better idea." He took the axe without asking and lined up the swing. The log split clean on the second hit. She blinked, then nodded once. "Thanks. Name's Orin Callahan," he said. "Yours, Odella James," she replied. "That's my boy, Cyrus." Cyrus peeked out from behind the doorframe with wide brown eyes. He did not say a word. "Where's his father?" Orin asked gently. Odella hesitated. "Then, dead 2 winters ago. Fever took him. Took our crops too, in a way. Never came back right." Orin nodded. "You got anyone else?" "Nope, just us. Place was my husband's family's. Nearest neighbor is 15 miles. I do what I can." He looked around. Nothing but dust and sun, and a woman too thin for the work she was doing. "You need help," he said. "I need a miracle," she replied. He let that sit a moment. Then he said, "I can mend fences, plant seed. Drive your wagon to town, you feed me, I work." Odella crossed her arms. "Why would you do that?" Orin shrugged. "Maybe I am tired of riding with no place to land." "Maybe you remind me of someone." Her jaw tightened, but she did not argue. By the end of the week, he had fixed the barn roof, patched the well pump, and cleared the back field. Odella watched him from the porch in the evenings, arms folded, eyes unreadable. Cyrus followed him like a shadow. "Why do you help?" Cyrus asked one day while Orin sharpened the plow blade. Orin looked at the boy. "Because your ma is trying, and trying should count for something." Cyrus nodded like he understood. That night, Odella brought out 2 plates instead of 1. She said nothing, just set the food down and sat across from him. Her hair was brushed, her dress clean. Orin felt something shift in his chest. Weeks passed. The land stayed dry, but the wind softened. Orin and Odella worked side by side, planting, hauling, sweating through the days. She laughed once, low and surprised, when he slipped in the mud. He stared at her like he had never seen sunlight before. One evening, after a long day cutting rows into the hard soil, Orin handed her a tin cup of water and said, "You ever think of starting over?" She looked at the horizon. "With what?" "With someone who does not leave." She did not speak for a long time. Then she said softly, "You planning to stay, Cowboy?" He reached out and brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. "If you will have me." Her breath caught. She did not pull away. Cyrus came running up then, holding something in his hand. "Mama, look, a sprout. Something's growing." Odella turned, eyes wide, and dropped to her knees beside the boy. Orin watched her face change from worry to wonder, from tightness to hope. She looked back at him. "Maybe," she said, voice shaking just a little, "we plant something that lasts." Orin smiled, heart full for the first time in years. That is the plan. And under the wide Wyoming sky, with dust still clinging to their boots and nothing but hard work ahead, a tired cowboy and a stubborn widow stood together in the fading light, not broken, not beaten, but beginning. By mid-May, the backfield had taken to the plow rows like they'd been waiting years to breathe again. Wheat and beans pushed through the cracked earth in slow, stubborn lines, and the days grew longer, the sun rising earlier with a kind of quiet promise. Cyrus had taken to riding on Orin's shoulders when the chores were light, and Odella allowed it. His laughter came easier now, sharp and sudden like a bird startled from brush. He had a habit of collecting strange things along the fence line: snake skins, twisted nails, a chunk of quartz he'd sworn was magic, and setting them on the windowsill like offerings. One afternoon, Orin found Odella kneeling by the well, sleeves rolled past her elbows, hands raw from scrubbing the pale rope. A streak of water ran down her arm, catching the sun. "You let me haul," he said. "You got enough wear without soaking your bones." She sat back on her heels, brushing hair from her face with the back of her wrist. "You think I'm made of glass?" "No," he said, crouching beside her. "I think you're near worn through." She studied him a moment before reaching for the rope again. "I'm not used to anyone noticing. You'll have to get used to more than that." The words hung in the air between them, plain and unhurried. Later that week, they walked the southern edge of the property where the fence had collapsed in on itself. The slats were too warped to salvage, but Orin had spotted cedar growing wild near the creek bed 2 miles east. He planned to cut and haul enough posts to last the season. As they paused, Odella leaned a hand on the fence stump, her fingers brushing the grain. "This land belonged to his grandfather," she said. "I never met the man, but they say he buried silver coins under the cornerstones of the house frame, for luck. Ever dig to see if it's true?" Orin asked. "No." She glanced back toward the house. "I figured luck wouldn't come from someone else's pockets," he nodded. "Still, might be worth a look one day." "I'd rather build something than find something," she said, and he smiled at that, not with his mouth, but in the softening of his eyes. A week later, Orin returned from town with seed potatoes in a borrowed wagon and a new tin kettle tucked beside them. Odella looked at the kettle and raised an eyebrow. "We didn't need that. It whistles," he said. "Figured you'd like the sound." She turned away, but not before he caught the way her lips pressed together to keep from curving. That evening, while she shelled beans by lamplight, he sat trimming the frayed hem of Cyrus's only good shirt. The boy had torn it climbing after a bird's nest, and Odella had sighed like she was used to mending what couldn't be helped. "Where'd you learn to stitch?" she asked without looking up. "Trail boss broke his arm once. I patched his coat with horsehair and twine." "Figured cotton would be easier." She stopped shelling. "You're a strange kind of cowboy, Orin Callahan. I've been told." That night, as the sky burned down to embers and the wind curled through the cracks in the walls, she stepped out onto the porch where he sat whittling by lantern light. "You ever think about what you'd be doing if you hadn't shown up here?" she asked. He set the knife down. "Waking up with dust in my throat and nothing ahead but the next trail." She leaned against the post, arms folded, gaze on the dark horizon. "I used to dream about leaving this place. Heading west, starting over, you still could." She shook her head slowly. "It's not the place, it's what it held, what it lost." He stood and crossed to her. "Then maybe it's time it held something new." Odella looked at him, long and steady, like she was measuring the truth in his face. Her voice, when it came, was quiet. "I don't know how to start again. You won't have to do it alone." She didn't answer, but she didn't step back either. Inside, Cyrus had fallen asleep with one of Orin's worn gloves clutched in his fist, the soft leather creased between small fingers. Morning would bring more work, more fence to cut, more fields to weed, more hands to scrub clean before supper. But for now, in the hush between days, the house stood with its doors open and its shadows warm. And for the first time in a long while, Odella didn't feel like she was waiting for something to end. By early June, the first beans showed their curling shoots above the soil, and the wheat stood ankle-high, pale green and trembling in the breeze. The mornings came soft and gold, dew hanging over the troughs, and the barn no longer leaned quite so far to the east since Orin braced its back wall with salvaged timber from the creaked cedar. Odella had taken to rising before the rooster, tying her hair in a knot at the nape of her neck, and stepping barefoot onto the porch to breathe in the hush. She didn't say so out loud, but Orin noticed how she lingered longer each morning, her shoulders no longer hunched like she expected the sky to fall. "Cyrus found a garter snake in the water barrel," she said one morning, brushing dirt from her palms as she joined Orin by the fence. He glanced up from where he was adjusting the wire. "Wasn't bit, was he? No, just about scared himself out of his shoes. You reckon he's the sort to scare easy?" She shook her head once. "No. He's the kind that runs toward the thing he fears, just to see it clearer." Orin tied off the last loop and leaned back. "That's a rare kind of boy." She glanced toward the house where Cyrus crouched with a stick, poking at a trail of ants along the porch rail. "He's got his father's stubbornness," she said, "but there's a steadiness in him now that wasn't there before." Orin didn't answer right away. The wind stirred the grass at their feet and a hawk circled far above, its cry thin and distant. "You ever been to Fort Laramie?" he asked. "Once. Years ago, we traded salt pork and a bushel of onions for a saddle blanket. They still hold dances there in summer. Stayed the night once, months back. Fiddler had a crooked bow but made the floorboards jump." She gave him a sidelong look. "You dance? I don't break rhythm, if that's what you mean." I'd never guessed it. He wiped his hands on his trousers and leaned against the post. "There's a barn out back of the mercantile. They string lanterns from the rafters. Folks wear their Sunday shirts even if it's Thursday." She smiled faintly. "You asking me to go? Only if you'd want to. You think I've got anything left to wear to a dance? I think you'd look fine in whatever you've got." She looked away toward the edge of the field. "I wouldn't know what to say to folks anymore. You wouldn't have to say much, just let them see you." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I'll think on it." That night, after Cyrus had fallen asleep curled beside a wool blanket on the floor, Odella stood at the basin, washing the day's dust from her arms. Orin sat by the door, oil lamp burning low, his hands working a bit of leather into a new strap for the mule's bridle. "I got a letter once," she said suddenly, voice low. "From my sister, lives near Rawlins. She'd heard about Marcus dying, said I should come stay with her. Start fresh." Orin kept his eyes on the strap. "Why didn't you?" She meant well. "But I didn't want to be someone else's burden. Figured if I stayed, I'd at least be standing on something that was mine, even if it was falling apart." He nodded, then looked up. "You think it still is?" "Falling apart," she met his gaze. "No, not anymore." The lamp hissed as the oil burned low. Outside, the crickets stirred. "I won't ask you to leave the place you've fought to keep," he said. "But if you ever wanted to build it into something new, something ours, I'd be ready." Her hands stilled in the basin. Water dripped from her fingers. "I didn't expect you," she said. "I didn't expect to stay." She stepped toward him, her bare feet whispering against the wood floor. When she reached him, she knelt and took the strap from his hands, setting it aside. "I don't dance," she said. "Never learned how." His voice was quiet. "Then we'll learn together." She leaned in, slow and sure, and rested her forehead against his. No declarations, no promises. Just breathe, shared in the hush of a night that felt like the beginning of something that would last. And in the dark, the house held its silence like a secret it no longer feared to keep. The rain came in late June, slow at first, then thick and steady, soaking into the cracked earth until it turned dark and fragrant. Odella stood at the threshold, hands on her hips, watching the droplets slide from the porch roof like beads off a string. She didn't say anything, just stepped back inside and reached for the flour sack. Orin set the last of the firewood beside the stove, his shirt clinging to his back. "It won't flood," he said, wiping the rain from his brow. "Creek's still low." "I'm not worried," she said, measuring out a handful of cornmeal. "Not about the water." He crouched and laid kindling beneath the stove's belly, striking the match low and careful. "Then what?" She opened her mouth, then paused. "It's strange, that's all. I don't remember the last time it rained while I felt something close to steady." The fire caught with a soft snap. "Steady don't mean soft," Orin said, standing again. "Just means you've got ground under your boots." She looked over her shoulder at him, the corner of her apron pinched between her fingers. "I don't think I ever expected ground to feel this solid." That evening, Cyrus built a fort beneath the table, 3 chairs and a quilt pulled taut, a tin plate balanced like a shield near the opening. He peeked out now and then, eyes bright, cheeks flushed with some imagined battle. When he finally crawled out, he held a wooden spoon like a sword and declared that no storm could defeat the James Callahan homestead. Odella blinked, but didn't correct him. After supper, Orin stepped outside to check the south gate. The air smelled of wet sage and wood smoke. When he returned, Odella was at the table, a sheet of muslin spread before her, needle in hand. "You sewing for someone?" he asked, hanging his coat near the door. "For the baby," she said, not looking up. He stopped. "You're sure?" "I've known a few weeks." She tied off the thread and set it aside. "Didn't want to say until I could feel it." He crossed the room slowly, pulled a stool beside her and sat. "You feel it now," she nodded once, then placed his hand against her stomach. "There?" He didn't speak, didn't move. His palm stayed still against the faint curve, as if afraid to press too hard. After a moment, she said, "You still want to build something here?" "I do, with roots and doors and room for more than 3. He looked at her then, his voice low. "I'm not going anywhere, Dell." She reached for his free hand and brought it to rest beside the other. "Then I'd like to marry you before the wheat comes in." He nodded, eyes never leaving hers. "We'll do it quiet, under the elm maybe, the one by the fence line, just us and the boy. We'll ask old Mr. Harlan to ride out and say the words." She sat back, exhaling slow. "I was afraid it'd feel like forgetting Marcus." "It doesn't. No. It doesn't." The rain softened into mist by morning, and the field stretched wide and green under the gray sky, thick with the promise of the season. Orin hitched the mule and turned the soil where the vine rose would go next spring. Odella moved slower now, but she still gathered eggs and boiled water and kept the corners of the house swept. Cyrus followed Orin with a stick over his shoulder, mimicking each stride, careful not to step on the new growth. "You think the baby's a girl or a boy?" he asked. "Don't know," Orin said, handing him a small piece of rope. "But I figure you'll teach it what it needs to know either way." Cyrus grinned and looped the rope around his waist like a lasso. That night, Odella stood brushing her hair near the stove, and Orin watched her from the table where he carved a cradle rail. "You ever think it'd feel like this?" he asked. She shook her head, hair falling like rivergrass over her shoulder. "Not once." He set the carving knife down and crossed to her. "Then I'm glad we were wrong." She turned, resting her forehead against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her, careful of the curve between them. Outside, the wind moved through the wheat like a hush, and the sky cleared, stars blinking into view one by one, quiet and sure. The elm tree stood just past the fence line, tall and broad, its leaves full and whispering in the late July breeze. The air smelled of warm grass and distant clover, and the soil beneath it had dried soft after weeks of steady sun. Orin had trimmed the lower branches the day before, and Odella had laid out a scrap of muslin for Cyrus to sit on while old Mr. Harlan, summoned from his modest ranch up by Horse Creek, cleared his throat and opened the worn black book he carried. Odella's dress was simple undyed cotton with a bit of lace she'd found tucked into the back of her old sewing box. Her hands didn't tremble, not even when Orin reached for them. Cyrus stood between them, solemn as a preacher's son, holding a small bouquet of wild yarrow he'd picked that morning after checking the trapline with Orin. "Do you come here freely and with purpose?" Mr. Harlan asked, voice thin but steady. "I do," Orin said, eyes never leaving hers. Odella answered the same, her voice low but sure. The vows were brief. There were no rings, no music, just the wind and the sky and the hush of the field all around. When Mr. Harlan closed his book and said, "You are husband and wife." Orin bent to kiss her, slow and easy, his hands at her waist, hers resting against his chest. Cyrus clapped once, then tucked the yarrow into his pocket like it was worth its weight in coin. Afterward, they shared bread and salted butter on the porch, while Mr. Harlan took his coffee black, and told a story about the first time he'd tried to court his late wife with a fiddle he didn't know how to play. Odella laughed, the sound softer than it used to be, and Orin leaned back in his chair, watching the way the evening light caught the edge of her hair. That night, after the boy had gone to sleep, Odella sat on the edge of the bed, brushing out her hair in the dim light of the oil lamp. Orin stood by the window, listening to the crickets, thumb pressed lightly to the edge of the sill. "Do you ever think about what you'd be now if you hadn't stopped here?" she asked. "I'd still be writing," he said, "still looking for something I didn't have a name for." She set the brush aside. "And now," he turned. "Now I've got more than I ever thought I had the right to want." The room was quiet. Then she lifted the quilt and held it open beside her. He crossed the floor without hurry, knelt to untie his boots, and slid in beside her. She rested her head on his shoulder, her hand over the place where their child stirred beneath her skin. The lamp burned low, and neither of them spoke again that night, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the silence between them had become a language all its own. Summer rolled into August, and the wheat ripened gold. Orin built a cradle from the same cedar he'd used for the barn rafters, smooth, sanded, and fitted with dowels he turned himself. He lined it with a cotton quilt Odella stitched from scraps of her old dresses, the blue one with the torn hem, the faded green she used to wear in the early days, when she still watched him like he might vanish if she blinked too long. The baby came on a clear morning in early September, after a night lit with stars and the hush of owls in the trees. Odella woke Orin with a hand on his arm and no fear in her voice, only certainty. Cyrus waited outside with the midwife's husband, whittling a stick to pass the time. When the door finally opened, Orin stepped out, hair damp, shirt wrinkled, and face open with something close to awe. "It's a girl," he said. Cyrus grinned. "We gonna name her after the tree," Odella, pale but smiling from the bed, said. "Her name's Elsie." The baby had a head full of dark, reddish hair and a cry like a hawk's call. She quieted only when Odella held her, and once when Orin laid his hand flat against her back, she turned her head and sighed like she already knew his voice. Fall came gently. The harvest was lean but enough. The porch roof held through the first frost. Cyrus started carving little animals from scrap wood and left one a rabbit with crooked ears beside Elsie's cradle. She gummed its ear every morning until her first tooth came in. On Sundays, Orin read to the children from a book of tall tales his mother had once sent him from Missouri. Odella would sit sewing near the fire, half listening, smiling when he got to the parts where the wolves talked or the rivers ran backward. One evening near the end of October, Orin stood with Odella beneath the elm, Elsie curled against her chest, and Cyrus tossing stones toward the fence post. "You ever think you'd have this?" he asked. "I hoped," she said. "Even when I didn't believe," he reached for her free hand. "You gave me a place to be. You gave me a reason to try again." They stood there until the light faded and the wind picked up just enough to rustle the leaves overhead. The house behind them glowed warm through the windows. The land around them, worn and worked and rooted deep, held them both quiet, steady, and whole. And in that place where loss had once settled like ash, two people who had come apart in different ways found the shape of something lasting, something made not of what they'd escaped, but what they'd chosen to build, and they never had to be alone again.